Good morning, everyone. We're beginning with part two now of Biblical Non-Orthodoxy's article entitled James, Paul, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. His subtext was, take a minute and reread the Epistle of James with the thought that every word is written to refute the false teachings of Paul. In other words, when you mentally draw in Paul's words that you know are on the same topic, compare them to what you're reading. So then, in order to provide you the basis for why you can trust that's the point of view, is has this article, James, Paul, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's where we learn of a conflict between somebody called the Zadik in the Dead Sea Scrolls and somebody called the Spouter of Lies. The author's name is Hanan ben Avram, and he also has clearly stated the following at the end of the article. He says, please consider reposting this article. Thank you, RD. So he wants people to repost it. So I'm reposting it with his express authorization. I'm trying to do it verbatim. I fill in a couple little details to help. But basically, I'm trying to bring forward his article for your consideration. Let's now resume with part two, picking up from where he was discussing how James died. And he mentioned there's several different people who give a story of it, but he says Josephus is the one we should rely upon because he's an eyewitness. So let's pick up where Hanan ben Avraham says the following. Because Joseph knew firsthand how James the Just, brother of Jesus, died, it would seem best to use his account of the murder of James the Just. According to him, when the Roman governor died in 62 Christian era and the new one was still on his way to Judea, establishment high priest Ananias ben Ananias used the occasion to illegally try and execute Jesus' brother James because of his role as supreme leader of the Jesus movement. He assembled this is a quote, Josephus. He assembled the Sanhedrin, that is the Supreme Court, of judges and brought before him the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But those citizens who seemed the most equitable and the most careful in the observation of the law were offended by this, Antiquities of the Jews. I just want to add something I know, having read it, is the story is justified or explained that James the Just was asked by the people of Jerusalem. The Jewish people had more confidence in him than the Herodian appointed high priest, and they wanted him to do the Yom Kippur service. And that's why when he did that, has a Levitical line through Mary. If I didn't mention it in the first part, that's something that we should all know because her cousin Elizabeth marries a Levite, and therefore her cousin herself had to be of a Levite lineage, which means the parent of Elizabeth has to be a Levite, just as Mary's parent would have to be of the same tribe because they're brother and sister, or sister and brother, whichever correspondence there is between her cousin's parents and her own parents, her own mother parents. Her father was obviously, or the father of Jesus was obviously Joseph. That's how the both genealogies in both Luke and Matthew both have a verse that is missing clearly because in Matthew it was numbered and it had to be the next numbered verse, and it had to be Joseph begat Jesus. And we found that in the Agnes Lewis earliest Bible, earliest New Testament in Syriac, in the one from dating from approximately the late 100s. All right. Anyway, so that's really why he gets killed. He was picked out of love and respect by the Jewish people to be put up as high priest for the holy day of Yom Kippur. All right, so let's pick up again from Mr. Avraham. 2 generations later, a more legendary account is recorded by Hegesippus, but with the note that James, quote, proved a true witness to Jews and Gentiles alike that Jesus is the Christ. Ecclesiastical History 2.23 of Eusebius. It is now we must turn to the Clementines for information on James' leadership, which tells us, quote, the assembly of the Lord, which was constituted in Jerusalem, was most plentifully multiplied and grew, being governed with the most righteous ordinances by James. Recognitions of Clement 1.43. The explanation is given in the homilies of Clement at 11.35 that James's appointment was at the command of Jesus himself. It reads, quote, our Lord and prophet, who has sent us, declared to us that the evil one, having disputed with him for 40 days, disputed with Jesus in the desert for 40 days, but failing to prevail against him, promised that he would send apostles from among his subjects to deceive them. Therefore, above all, remember to shun any apostle, teacher, or prophet who does not accurately compare his teaching with James, the brother of our Lord, and this, even if he comes to you with recommendations. I'm going to just interject there. The word recommendations is referring to letters of recommendation, something that is mandatory in that culture of that time. If you had a sect, a group, and that had already founded different denominational locations for worship, you could not uh, be someone who would be allowed to teach in there unless you had a letter of recommendation. So no church that was under the control of the 12 who did not give a letter of commendation to Paul could preach in that place. And you can see Paul is very angry about the fact he doesn't get letters of commendation in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2, in order to preach. And that's what Bishop Ambrose even mentions in his commentary on Corinthians. And then Ambrose says the explanation for that is the 12 had already determined that Paul was a false apostle. And then Ambrose says, this is the Bishop of Milan, by the way, in the 380s, he's saying, but because the Corinthians had seen the signs and wonders of Paul, they accepted him as an apostle anyway, and they let him teach him. So that's the background that is behind this word recommendations, and that Jesus's command was, do not listen to somebody, even if they have recommendations that appear to be from us, if they contradict James. Okay, so now Hanan, the author of this article, will continue, and he's going to tell you about what Paul, prior to his time of allegedly becoming a Christian, he was involved in the attempted murder of James the Just. So here's the account. In the recognitions of Clement, we also learn of someone named Saul, quote, one of our enemies, close quote, who upon entering the temple with a few other companions while James was reading and interpreting Bible prophecy concerning Jesus, quote, began to cry out, and while James the bishop was refuting him, he began to drive all into confusion with shouting and undo what was arranged with much labor, close quote. A riot ensues, quote, in the midst of which this enemy attacked James and threw him headlong from the top of the temple steps, and supposing him to be dead, cared not to inflict further violence upon him, end of quote. Though James doesn't die here, both his legs were broken, so, quote, our friends lifted him up, and we returned to the house of James and spent the night there in prayer. Then, before daylight, we went down to Jericho to the number of 5,000 men. And Hanan tells you, take a look at Acts 4, verse 4. Then this Saul, like the Saul who became Paul in Acts, quote, received a commission from Caiaphas, the high priest, that he should arrest all who believed in Jesus and should go to Damascus with his letters, and that there also, employing the help of unbelievers, he should make havoc among the faithful, and that he was hastening to Damascus chiefly on this account. Recognitions of Clement 1.70-71. Compare this Clementine recognitions passage to Acts 8, verse 3, and Acts 9, 1-2, which read together, quote, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, and, breathing out threats and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest, and desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any one of this way, whether they be men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem, end of quote. Hanan continues, it is on this trip, according to Acts, that Paul first sees Jesus, confounded the Jews who dwelled in Damascus, and that after this, quote, the Jews took counsel to kill him, watching the gates night and day to kill him. That's Acts 8:3 and Acts all the way to Acts 9, verse 23. This was how Paul came to know the movement. For as he says, quote, I certify you, brothers, that the gospel which was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from man, nor was it I taught it, but it came through revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the assembly of God violently and tried to destroy it. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son in me, Jesus Christ, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to those who were apostles before me. But I went away into Arabia, and again I returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Peter, and then stayed with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now the things I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. All right, this will be the end of part 2, and we saw here at the very end that Paul has admitted he's not gotten anything from the 12. He doesn't care what they would claim as the words of Jesus. And he explains in chapter 2 Corinthians 12 as well that he's getting these experiences in the third heaven. He can't repeat any of them. He can't quote Jesus. It's unintelligible, and it's also unlawful for him to tell you what Jesus says, but you're just supposed to trust him that when he's communicating to you, and even though he doesn't quote Jesus, you're supposed to believe it's all from God or Jesus somehow. That's the odd thing here. Is he got nothing from the 12. He doesn't repeat anything they teach because he doesn't care what they teach. That's why he doesn't say anything that's in the Gospels. He doesn't even quote it except the liturgy, which anybody would know if they know how to do the communion service. That's it. It's the only thing he seems to know from the Gospels. All right, everybody. We'll pick it up on the next episode, part 3.